I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he couldn't talk, but there were no medical reasons as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the deep south and joined the military when he was 19, but one night, he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room, and in my part of the Midwest, and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They demanded to not be contacted again. Marion paced all day, every day, moving his mouth that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open, as if he were laughing heartedly, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing, because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at the job, the last thing I saw was Marion pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. I am a psychiatrist, and during my training years, I worked for 6 months at a ward treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. It was an old building, which had been housing psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. On our floor we had 13 beds and a nursing station, a living room, and a few conference rooms. One day, a few weeks in, I am interviewing a patient who tells me she has heard a baby crying at night, waking her up. There are no babies in that hospital, as the place is situated far away from housing areas, and there were restricted visiting hours. Afterwards, the nurse pulls me aside and tells me that the baby crying thing is not a psychotic symptom. She is very serious about this, but won't elaborate. I kind of shrug it off, as either way, it does not change the diagnostic or treatment, and forget about the experience. Around 3 months in my stay, I sit in the nurse's station, and 3 nurses behind me are talking. One of them says, "She is very active today," and the other says, "Really? Oh, I hadn't noticed." I turn around and ask them, "Who are they talking about?" They look at each other, and then one of them hesitantly says, "Well, there's a baby here. She cries sometimes." I, of course, say no, but they just kind of shrug and smile. Not 30 seconds later, I hear it. It sounded far away, but not too far. A cry, clearly a baby's cry, sounding like it is separated from us by maybe 2 or 3 walls. I am perplexed and look at the nurses. They look at me as if to say, "I told you so." Since then, I heard it maybe 2 or 3 times a week. I told a new doctor about it. A few weeks into her stay, she came to me, white as a sheet, and told me she had heard it on her coffee break. All the nurses just kind of knew about it, and being in psychiatry, hearing that kind of stuff is not really something you brag about. I was transferred and haven't heard it since. I think about it sometimes, but I don't really know what to make of it. I was a new nurse at our hospital, and had only been working there a couple of months. I had brought a patient of mine up to the day surgery from the ER for an endoscopy, and they called back down and asked me to bring her family up because she only spoke Italian and they needed someone to consent for the procedure. After dropping them off, I walked past the waiting room to head back down to the hall, to the elevators. I took the back way to get to the ER, and the hallways are always deserted. It used to be the pediatric wing of the hospital, but that is all shut down for years, and the rooms are just empty and full of broken equipment and beds. As I reached the old nurse's station at the T-junction between the pediatric hallway and the hallway that goes down to the elevators, I saw a little girl standing across from the nurse's station further down the hall. She had big pigtails, was wearing a brown dress, white shoes, holding a teddy bear. I thought perhaps she was a family member who had walked away from the day surgery waiting room. I was concerned that she would go into one of the rooms and get hurt or lost. So I said, "Hey, little girl, what are you doing? You don't need to be over there. You're going to get hurt." And I walked around the nurse's station to grab her hand and bring her back. And then she vanished. As I got about 15 feet away from her, every hair on my body stood up straight, and I turned and ran like a bat out of hell down to the elevator. I pounded that button for what seemed like an eternity until the elevator got to the floor. As I got back to the ER, I walked up to the nurse's desk, white as a sheet, and one of the old nurses looked at me and said, "What happened? What's wrong with you?" I remember babbling like an idiot as I tried to tell them what happened. After listening to me for a moment or two, the nurses said, "Oh, you saw that little girl ghost. She's been around here for years." And I remember saying, "Well, thanks for telling me about it before this." Apparently, the ghost has even been seen down in the ER, ducking in and out of patient rooms and peeking around the curtains. My wife worked up on the 7th floor, and she said that one time on nights, a whole row of patient rooms started yelling about a little girl that was running around in the rooms. I guess she gets around. My mother trained as a nurse at the old Westminster Teaching Hospital in London in the 1950s. One of her first night shifts, she was doing rounds in the children's ward. Everything was fine. All the kids were asleep. But in one of the rooms, she found the sink faucet running, which was a bit weird because it had been fine when she'd been by a few minutes before. She figured that one of the kids had gotten up and been thirsty or something, so she turned it off and carried on with her rounds. When her first shift was over, she checked out with the matron, who asked if she'd had anything to report. She said there was nothing, except that someone had left a faucet on in one of the rooms. The matron looked horrified and gasped, "Oh no." She then explained that the ward was haunted by a ghost, which washed its hands, leaving the faucet running whenever a child was going to die. My mother laughed this off, pointed out that none of the kids in the ward were seriously ill, and went home. When she came in for her shift the next evening, she discovered that a previously perfectly fine child in that room had had a sudden seizure and died only a few hours after she'd found the open faucet. I work as an ICU nurse. A mid-20s female came in with some serious cardiac abnormalities and then went into respiratory distress. Never had any medical history at all. We had to put her on the ventilator, but she was on just enough sedation to keep her lucid. She could nod, shake her head yes and no, appropriately, to questions. One night, the patient in the room next to hers died, but the body was still in the room, about to be taken to the morgue. The female patient's door was closed, with the curtains drawn, so she couldn't have seen what was going on next door. When I went in to check on her, she had a look of sheer panic on her face. Trembling, I asked her a series of questions to see if she was cold, hot, in pain, etc., and she denied all. I asked her if she saw something. She started to aggressively nod her head. Yes. She wasn't on any drugs that would make her hallucinate. I went on to get details on what this thing looked like. After playing 20 questions, I got this. A man, pale white, left arm missing, heavy, bald, standing still, behind me. This was the man who had just died next door. I spent the rest of the night consoling her. I was on call one evening in the winter, and since I used to live 45 minutes away, I just decided to sleep in the hospital due to the distance. I usually slept in one of the unused exam rooms, near the cath lab and cardiac recovery unit, and aside from the occasional janitor, nobody bothered me. I liked exam room 3 the best, since it had a marginally more comfortable bed. One night I wake up at 11:36 p.m. and just have a weird feeling. I don't usually sleep well on call anyway, so this wasn't out of the norm. In the darkness, and all in quick succession, I hear in the ceiling a metallic thud, something plastic on the counter move, and a paper towel from the dispenser wave in the breeze. I was too scared to look over in that corner. I just felt like a little kid while I pulled the covers tighter and tried to go back to sleep. I found out the next morning that the exam room 3 is where the cath lab will occasionally store the bodies of the deceased, and this is if the family would like to have some private moments before being taken to the morgue. So yeah, I never slept in that room again.